Hey everybody, trying this again. So this is a live stream. I do these as live streams because it's just easier for me to record it this way. Eventually I'll figure out how to record videos without running out of room. So for those of you who are watching this in the future, welcome. This is another majestic INFJ, and if you haven't seen a video by me before, I pretty much just do riffs, long form riffs on any particular subject or topic, on personality typing, MBTI, Jungian cognitive functions, that sort of thing. I sort of assume that you've got sort of a baseline knowledge of the different personality types, what the cognitive functions are. But this is just sort of a riff on things I picked up along the years or sort of noticed. Okay, so without further ado, today I want to tackle what I think is a pretty prominent issue in psychological typing, and that's what we mean, or what is intended when somebody says objective versus subjective in the cognitive functions world. And this all stems from the original Jung writings on psychological types, and he used the term objective and subjective to describe the various types. And if you use it, in a lot of the confusion when people are sort of throwing terms around like objective or subjective, the confusion comes because a lot of people tend to think of objective and subjective in their sort of normal everyday use. And even Jung, when he was writing about this stuff, he recognized that, people are going to sort of, when he uses the term subjective or objective, people are going to sort of use the everyday term, and it might lead to some confusion. So he spends a lot of time sort of explaining what he means and what he doesn't mean when he uses these terms. So when it comes to the cognitive functions, or at least when people are talking about Jung and the cognitive functions, and it's sort of progressed through the years, and we'll get to that in a second. Jung was, when he uses the term objective, what he really means is object oriented. So oriented to the outside world, the world of objects, and that could be things or people, things that are outside of the subject, the individual doing the thinking. And it doesn't necessarily mean objective in the way that we think about it in everyday terms, such as, you might be thinking of objective means everybody agrees to it, or it's sort of it's real or true independent of the person, right? So if there were no people, this thing would still be blue. It's an objective fact that everybody can agree on. And that's not really what he meant. Now, there is a lot of overlap, right? Because if you're talking about the outside world and you're talking about people being outside focused, so they're objectively focused, or their attitude is towards the object, there's probably going to be a lot of overlap with, the common everyday use of objective of, yeah, that's something that everybody can agree on exists. For example, this is a blue-ish cup. Some people might disagree whether it's blue or gray, but most people will agree it's a cup. So there's a consensus. There's sort of the quote unquote objective reality that, everybody, with sort of, who's acting in good faith and has all of their cognitive processes intact, will agree that this is a cup. So even though there's some overlap, the better way to think about it when you're talking, or when you're reading about or hearing people talk about objective versus subjective, think about it as just object oriented, right? So even though there might be a lot of overlap with everybody can build a consensus and agree that this is objectively a cup, when you're talking about the cognitive functions, it's really about just the simple fact that your attention, or Jung would say your energy or your libido, is directed towards the cup. Okay. And then on the flip side is subjective. And this is a little bit more, in line with our everyday thinking of, this is just sort of what we subjectively feel. But again, when Jung is talking about it, he is talking about your energy being oriented towards the self, right? Towards you as the thinker. And he spends some time talking about, everybody's subjective reality, or the little universe that you've built up in your head, is just as real as the outside world. And so he took that very seriously, that just because something is quote unquote subjective doesn't make it any less real than this cup that is outside of the thinker's mind. Now that gets very, very deep. It gets into his idea of the collective unconscious and archetypes and all of that, and we can save that for another time, or there's plenty of videos out there on that kind of stuff. But he is making the argument that each one of us, so all 8 billion or whatever, however many there are of us in the world, each have our own little universe that exists in our mind, and it's just as real as the outside universe. And then he would go even further and say that there's sort of this shared internal universe that we all have through sort of evolution, and who else knows what's going on. Okay, and so to say something that is quote unquote subjective when you're talking about Jung doesn't mean that it's not real, or it's open to interpretation or something like that. Not necessarily. All he's saying is that it's thought or cognitive processes that are directed towards the individual, as opposed to the outside world. And we'll talk about some examples and maybe sort of flesh that out a little here. Okay. And so let me give an example, and then we'll sort of dive into how this all sort of unpacks when we talk about the cognitive functions. So let me think here. So if you wanted a really good example to me for what Jung is talking about when he's talking about objective versus subjective, is just watch little kids at the playground, or if they're playing sports or anything like that, and you see it right away if you're looking for it. So a really good example is kids on monkey bars. There are some kids that will just get up and jump on the monkey bars and start going, right? And they're not really thinking what's necessarily going to happen to them. They're just sort of interacting directly with the monkey bars. And then there's other kids that you'll see kind of get up to the monkey bars, and you just see the wheels going in their head, right? Just turning in their head, and you can see them thinking of, okay, what's going to happen to me? Right? And what happens if I fall? What happens if I don't make it all the way? What if I can't make it all the way to the other side? Am I going to get stuck? Am I going to have to go back? You just see them thinking it. And if you ask the little kid, most likely they're probably not going to tell you what they're thinking. But it's very noticeable. And then also just put little kids out on a soccer field and just throw a soccer ball out there. And the kids that are object oriented, you'll just see run straight for the ball. And the kids that are more sort of internal subject oriented, they kind of just stand around and wait for the ball to come to them, right? And they're not, I don't want to say that they're necessarily scared of the ball or scared of the other kids. That could be part of it. But that would also be very subjective, right? But there's just sort of this sense of like the ball's gonna come to me, right? And then when I get the ball, I'll figure out what to do with it. And it's very again, it's kind of hard to articulate it, but you definitely see it if you're thinking about it. Um, where the object oriented kids, they're not really thinking so much about themselves. They're thinking about getting the ball and doing whatever you're supposed to be doing with the ball, get it in the net or get it, or whatever, dribble it. Um, and the internally focused kids, they're the ones sort of standing around, sort of waiting for things to happen while their coach is yelling at them, go get the ball. And so for those of you who have kids that are the sort of stand around and wait for things to come to me, be careful, don't push them too hard on the sports thing, because it just might not align with how they think about the world, because of this objective versus subjective distinction, right? So kids that are more subjective, they do great at swimming, they do great at diving, they do great at golf, they do great at usually baseball, things that are sort of fixed world. They do pretty well at, but things like soccer, basketball, football, lacrosse, field hockey, things where you have to sort of react in the moment and react to the objective world, they get a little lost in that. And then on the flip side, the kids that are very object oriented, they don't want to do the swimming or the golf necessarily. Or the base, they might see it as too boring or, whatever. But this is a good example of how, if you sort of know how the different functions work and the different personality types, you can avoid a whole lot of nightmares in the future, just by, sort of understanding that kids, at a very, very early age, you see it very early, sort of fall into one of these camps. And Jung, when he was talking about this, he was like, look, this is sort of an evolutionary sort of gift or product of evolution, because we need people who are object oriented and we need people who are subject oriented, right? The object oriented tend to be, they do tend to be males, but, and probably evolutionarily speaking, they would be the males that are going out and doing the hunting, right? They have to sort of be object oriented to be a successful hunter. If they're just sort of standing around thinking about, different ideas or things that are sort of subjective to them, they might miss the deer that's running by. But, and then also, I don't want to make this a male female thing, because obviously it's, it occurs in both. And the female, an object oriented female might, again, in the hunter gatherer sort of culture, might be more involved in like the planting and planting crops or whatever, but something sort of object oriented that wasn't necessarily out doing hunting. And then on the flip side, the introverted subjective types, these were more of people who would sort of stay behind and sort of take care of the community, take care of the kids. They weren't necessarily out hunting, but they were providing a useful service by taking care of the community. And the male, and if there's sort of an introverted male, they tend to be sort of the religious figures of the group, right? Once religion started coming around, being the shamans or the priests or, whatever, the particular group's religion was, because it's, it's sort of subjective, but it's, helping take care of the group, that kind of thing. And so you see this breakup, just sort of through evolutionary process. And with Jung, it's more about just sort of balance, right? It's, do you tend to balance towards the objective world or the subjective world? And again, outside world versus internal world. Um, and and he would sort of make the argument that you sort of want to have some sort of balance to be sort of a healthy, psychologically healthy individual, right? And so if you're too object oriented, you can get yourself into situations where you're working all the time because the outside world is just constantly dragging you along, and you just aren't thinking about yourself, right? And with Jung, I mean, keep in mind, all the psychological type stuff wasn't necessarily Jung trying to, you know make any deep dive discoveries, even though it was very deep. This was all sort of a field guide, for other psychologists out there, where, if somebody has this particular type of personality, then they're more likely to have this type of neurosis or this type of psychological problem. So if somebody's very object oriented, and they become workaholics because their job, the money and um the work that is required, in the physical outside world, is just dragging them along. And it, and it's not necessarily subjective, like they want to be successful, internally, or they want to make a lot of money internally. It's just that they're just so focused on the outside world that they just can't help themselves but keep working. um Another example, um well, let's stick with the workaholic. They're just sort of doing it without even knowing that they're doing it, or having a reason why. It's not for the money. It's not for, the promotion or anything. It's just purely the outside world dragging them along. And what Jung's argument was is, if you're too outside, if you're too um, weighted, or too focused on the outside world, then the subjective world is going to start rearing its ugly head, right? To create some sort of balance between the two. Jung was very much about, the yin and the yang, the balance of the universe, the balance of the psyche. And so if you're too focused on the outside world, your body might all of a sudden say, hey, I'm really thirsty all of a sudden, so I'm going to start drinking a lot, drinking a lot of alcohol. And it could create alcoholism because you've rejected your body in favor of the outside world, and your body is sort of piping up and saying, hey, you need to pay attention to me too. Another funny example he uses is, some guy gets infatuated with a very beautiful younger girl that what was the word he used? That he sort of over exaggerates her worth or her value or something. His polite way of putting it. And so somebody, some man becomes obsessed with this woman, and then all of a sudden he starts having, sort of stomach problems or something, some digestive problem, because again, he's ignoring himself, and now his self is sort of rearing its ugly head. And now all of a sudden, he needs to be taken care of, health wise. And then because of that, he loses this beautiful girl because she really doesn't care about him as much as he thought she did or something, and doesn't want to, have to play caretaker for him. And so again, this is just sort of a field guide. On the opposite end, if you're too focused on the subjective and you're sort of ignoring the objective, then Jung would argue that starts building up, um, narcissism and just sort of an overinflated sense of ego and overinflated sense of self, where you're just ignoring the outside world and just sort of focusing on your subjective, yourself, right, and what you want out of the situation, not necessarily always introverted feeling, but it could be introverted thinking too, that you know other people are just always wrong and you're always right. And that could be the case, but uh, but but it does sort of you know lead to this overinflated sense of self and this sort of withdrawing from society. And you can become very reclusive and sort of a hermit, or just sort of a narcissist, where you just start ignoring and rejecting the outside world, and then that can cause all sorts of problems as well. You can start getting paranoid, that people are out there, trying to get you, things like that, because you're ignoring the outside world so much. But then that balance starts rearing its ugly head, and now all of a sudden the outside world starts causing problems for you. Just like on the flip side, the subjective world started causing problems for the people who were too outside or object oriented. Okay, so um, so that's a little bit of background, uh, for the objective versus subjective. And again, there is some overlap, right, with the everyday use of the word objective. Like, it's real, everybody can agree to it. Uh, yeah, there's going to be some overlap, but you can think of things that are not necessarily true that are object oriented. Like if somebody's having hallucinations and other people aren't seeing it, and is that objectively there in the real world, but it is still sort of outward world focused, right, in a weird kind of way, even though it's your own mind making it. Um, so hopefully that makes sense. But I think the best way to sort of think about it again is just thinking about little kids on a soccer field, which kids run after the ball and are very object oriented, very outside world oriented, versus which kids are just sort of waiting for things to come to them. Okay, so let's talk about the cognitive functions and how sometimes this can lead to some confusion. And one thing I do want to note is, Jung's description is not necessarily what people think of when they're talking about cognitive functions these days, right? I mean, I know everybody sort of likes to think of Jung as sort of, the final word on all of this stuff. And if it doesn't match up with what Jung was saying, then it's wrong. I think there actually has been some development along the way, just in general psychology, just in general cognitive psychology. We think about thinking and logic and feeling and emotion and all that kind of stuff very differently than they did in his day. So I think it's hard to just, you know, take the way he was thinking about it and the way that he was describing it, and then, sort of use that as sort of the gold standard. I think we have sort of adopted through socionics and to some extent MBTI, um, and the Kiersey temperaments, things like that. Sort of a better, I think, understanding BB, all those people who have sort of come after Jung. Okay, so that's just my way of saying that, just because Jung said it one way or thought about it one way doesn't necessarily make it right. It is sort of the groundwork, it's the foundation, but we've sort of, I think, as a community, sort of developed, or refined our ways of thinking about things a little bit more. Okay, back to the cognitive functions. Sorry for the digression. So, thinking where you usually see it pop up is the extroverted thinking versus introverted thinking, right? And extroverted feeling versus introverted feeling. But so you'll see a lot of um, descriptions of, okay, what's the difference between extroverted thinking and introverted thinking? Well, extroverted thinking is object oriented and objective, right? Because that's what Jung said. And introverted thinking is subject oriented and subjective, right? And so now you could see that this starts, if you use the everyday use of the word objective versus subjective, you start seeing how this might lead to confusion, right? Because it it makes people think, oh, well, extroverted thinking is the objective reality and what we all agree on is being true. Um, and then introverted thinking is just what you happen to think about it, right? And it may or it may not be true, but it's, based off of your own truth or your own personal experience or whatever. It's subjective. And yeah, there is some overlap, and Jung sort of gets into that a little, but he wasn't really trying to say that subjective thinking is just sort of whatever you happen to think about it. It's just that you sort of insert yourself into the process. So the example he used is, most people, when they see it's raining outside, will put on a coat because that's just what you do. That's just sort of the extroverted thinking way of dealing with rain, where somebody else might say, you know what, I'm not going to put on a coat because I want to build my physical stamina or fortitude. And I'm just going to endure the pain of the rain for whatever reason. Like people who jump into cold lakes or ice baths, they want to build strength through, perseverance. And so they're sort of inserting their self into the formula, right? And they came out with another on another end. And so it leads to a lot of confusion, right? If you're thinking of introverted thinking as just what you think versus extroverted thinking is what everybody else thinks, then it becomes this like, okay, well, is introverted thinking just your opinion? What is it? So let me back up and tell you what I think and others think um, is the real difference between extroverted thinking and introverted thinking, and then how that maps on to objective versus subjective. Okay. So I apologize in advance. This gets a little complicated. So hopefully what, what I'm talking about makes sense. So let's start with introverted thinking. I think the best way to think about introverted thinking is just logic, um, pure logic, formal logic, right? So if P, then Q. So therefore, if P, then Q. So if uh, excuse me, if all dogs are poodles, or sorry, if all poodles are dogs, Shane is a poodle, therefore Shane is a dog, right? Formal logic. Um, or you could say Shane is not a dog, therefore Shane is not a poodle, because all poodles are dogs. Um, so that would be your formal introverted thinking logic process. And people who have high TI are very good at logic puzzles. Again, go to Talking with Famous People, watch some of the testing sessions, and you'll just see that there's some people that can just rattle off answers to these introverted thinking logic questions because it's just purely formal logic, where other people who might not have TI up on their front stack, um, have more have more difficulty with them. They can eventually probably do them if they sort of thought about it. But again, this is all about attention, right? And how quickly can you get your attention to focus on this particular cognitive function? And so those with really high TI, their attention just automatically goes to it and they can sort of process it pretty quickly. Um, okay, so introverted thinking is formal logic and it's just symbol based logic, right? And so in that sense, it's objective in the everyday use of the term, right? Like, if something is logically valid, then that means that it is objectively true. That everybody in the normal, use of the word objective, right? Everybody will agree that that's objectively true, and so that's why you start seeing this breakdown, because if you're describing extroverted thinking as things that are objectively true that everybody agrees on, now it's like, okay, well, then what the hell is introverted thinking? And my argument is that no, introverted thinking is the formal logic. And as long as it's valid, and as long as the presumptions are true, or the assumptions or whatever is going into the formula, then it will be objectively true, right? Now there are people who aren't very good at logic, or have the wrong presumptions or assumptions built into their formula. Like, they might think, for example, they might think all um, all poodles are cats, and they're just fundamentally wrong on the premise, right? And then you could say Stanley is a poodle, and the valid answer would be, well, Stanley is a cat, right? So that would be the logically valid answer, um, if your assumptions were true. However, everybody on the outside world would disagree with them and say, no, even though you're logically valid, even though, if you take the formula, all poodles are cats, therefore, and Stanley is a poodle, therefore Stanley is a cat. That's logically valid, but it's not true in reality. It's not true objectively, right? In the normal sense of the word, right? But that was still the person doing introverted thinking, right? So introverted thinking is just plugging and chugging through logical formulas, and you could be wrong, or you could be right, depending on how good you are at it and how good the database is, or how accurate the database is that you're using. Okay, hopefully that made sense. Right? But again, think of introverted thinking as this formal logic: if P, then Q. Um, and pretty much all of your knowledge base can be built off of that. And so what's subjective about it is that knowledge base that you've built over time using formal logic, right? And it sort of builds off of each other, right? Or off of itself, right? As you come up with a conclusion, then you can plug it into another formula, and you build this sort of hierarchy of knowledge just using logical formal logic, or logical equations. Okay, now let's contrast that with extroverted thinking. Okay, so I'm going to argue here that extroverted thinking is is planning in the outside object oriented world. So we're going to ignore dealing with people. We're dealing with objects like cars and radios and computers, things like that. And you have this whole part of the brain that deals with planning from part A to part B. It's your frontal lobe, dorsal, lateral, frontal lobe. And so you want to change a tire on your car, you want to fix a broken computer, you want to build a baby's crib, you want to build a house, you want to build a table. You got to start from point A and get to point B. And usually there's a very sequential number of steps, right? To get you from point A to point B. So if somebody said, okay, build me a table and gave you a bunch of wood, right? Just a bunch of, wood that was uncut, whatever. How do you get from just this pile of wood to a wooden table, right? And if you're strong in extroverted thinking, then you can figure that out, right? Even if probably nobody even told you how to do it. If you're like me and all the other INFJs out there and ISFJs, if you're TE polar, that is just a nightmare. I can't imagine somebody handing me a pile of wood and saying, okay, go make a table. Like, there's just no way. Like, you can give me any other task on Earth, and I could probably, at least try to do it. But, handing me a pile of wood or a pile of stone or whatever, and just saying, all right, go at it. You got 2 hours or 2 days to make a table. Good luck. And a lot of it's just because I just wouldn't even know where to start, right? And even when I did start, I wouldn't know what to do next. And so that's extroverted thinking. That's going from point A to point B, pile of wood to a finished wooden table. Makes absolutely no sense to me. Somebody would have to take years training me how to do that. And even then, I probably wouldn't feel too comfortable with it. So, anyways, but those who have strong TE, probably would love a challenge like that. They got no problem with it. So is that objective? Is it subjective? Well, it depends. It depends on, whose definition of objective or subjective are we using? If we're using the sort of Jungian sort of, self-oriented versus object-oriented, it could be a little bit of both, right? I mean, it's obviously object oriented, right? You have this big pile of wood and you got to change it into another object, another thing in the outside world. And there might be sort of tried and true rules that if you just follow these rules and follow these steps, you'll get from point A to point Z eventually. You'll get from your pile of wood to your finished table eventually if you just follow these easy steps. But somebody could take a more subjective, view of it and say, look, I know that the rest of the world does it this way, but this is the way I like to do it. I like to do step A and then jump to step D, or I like to make my tables like this, with this sort of appearance or this sort of structure, where everybody else in the world likes to make their tables with a different structure. My tables have 3 legs. Everybody else's have 4. But for some reason mine tend to work. That kind of thing. Now that could be very subjective, right? But it's still object oriented, right? In the Jungian sense, you're still directing your energy towards the object. You might be putting some of your subjective flair into it, but at the end of the day, it's very object oriented. Now, in sort of the sort of modern way of thinking about it, I would say this is very TE, because it's, the cognitive function at hand is step by step ordinal behavior. You got to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 in a very ordinal sort of way, and figure out the steps along the way, or at least remember them if somebody told you about them. Very TE, extroverted. And but again, it could be subjective in the sense that people have different ways of doing it, right? It could be objective because everybody does it the same way. And if you just follow the steps that everybody else does, okay, that's a very quote unquote objective, outside world kind of way, or if you just figure it out on your own and say, this is the way I like to do it, that could be very subjective, right? So very hard. So it's very hard to use those terms, objective versus subjective, and when you're thinking about, well, what's the difference between TI and TE, because they both have that sort of component to it, right? So you don't want to just think of it as one versus the other, where extroverted thinking is objective and introverted thinking is subjective. Yeah, they tend to maybe lean that way, but there's so much overlap that it just causes way too much confusion when people are trying to think about what type somebody is or how the different types work. Same thing for extroverted feeling, introverted feeling. A lot of people will describe extroverted feeling as, sort of going with the crowd, going with, it's objective in the sense that this is what everybody else wants, and this is what everybody else values, and what everybody else, feels about this particular issue. And so I'm just going to go with the crowd. And that is described as being quote unquote objective. And Jung would say, well, you're basing your values on on things going on the outside world, and not things going on the inside world. You're basing your values off of what other people think, right? And so when he called that objective, it wasn't because there was this general consensus and everybody shares the same opinion and it's therefore objective. That wasn't it. It was just that your whatever value or whatever opinion you generate or whatever feeling you have is being pulled out of you by these outside factors, right? You're just going with the crowd. On the flip side, introverted feeling would be you come up with your own feeling, your own values. And I think this is kind of what most people think of as, values and feelings is just the subject, right? What do I think about it? And you don't have these outside forces pulling you to form an opinion or to form your feeling. It's all internal. It's that internal world, that collective unconscious, those archetypes buried deep inside of you that are directing you or pulling you into whatever opinion it is you have or whatever feeling it is that you have. That's the very Jungian way of thinking of it. I think the modern way, I would argue extroverted feeling is more about doing the same sort of planning behavior, getting from point A to point Z, but in the social domain. So instead of giving somebody a big pile of wood and saying, make me a table, which is a TE function or problem, instead you're given, you give somebody a group of people and say, throw a party, or run a political campaign, or get, all of these, get me from point A to point B, solve this problem, but we got to use people to do it. It's in the social domain, right? And so you got to coordinate and you got to get everybody on board and sort of grease the wheels that need to be greased, that kind of thing. Flatter the people who need to be flattered. And then also, don't invite the people who are going to be annoying everybody to the party, that kind of thing. And so it's outside focused. You're dealing with the social domain. You're trying to get from point A to point B. And so in that sense, it's object oriented. It has to do with the outside world. And then you compare that to introverted feeling. And, again, that's how I feel about the situation. That's my personal opinion or value that I assign to this particular object or this particular person. It's not so much trying to socially plan or get yourself from point A to point B in the social domain. It's just you personally. How do you feel about things or people? It's not just people. And if you watch my other video, I compare introverted feeling to introverted thinking, as introverted thinking is this logic based formula where introverted feeling is more of a shortcut, like what do I think about something? And you could imagine, just through evolution, we develop these just shortcuts that are based off of opinion because if you see something red in the forest, that usually means it's good, but not always, right? So logically, you're not sure if it's a good thing or not, but feeling wise, you might say, oh, that's an apple or some other sort of fruit and go after it because usually there's a benefit to it. And you're not necessarily thinking about it in formal logic terms. You're just thinking go, no go. Is this good or not good? And so that's your introverted feeling. It's very subjective to you, might not necessarily be true in the objective world or the outside world, but it's true to you. It's what you think. And then at a very large scale, it's your authenticity. It's, how you feel about the world and your opinions on various matters that are, that you might have picked up along the way, and you might share the opinion you have about red objects. You might share with 99% of the world, right? And so in that sense, it could be quote unquote objective because your whole life, everybody around you said, have told you that this is the way to think about things. This is what to value. This is what you should feel when it comes to these various things. And so you might personally really believe that, right? That's your subjective feeling, even though it's other people telling you that that's how you should feel about it. You just sort of learned along the way and you're like, okay, I agree with them. I they're telling me I should like this kind of music, and I actually do like this kind of music, right? So just because it's subjective doesn't mean it has to be against or, somehow, differ from the popular opinion. That's fine. Just because it's popular opinion doesn't mean you can't share in that opinion, and it still makes it subjective. It's your opinion. And just because you happen to agree and other people happen to agree with you on that opinion doesn't mean that, it's extroverted feeling. It doesn't mean that other people are shaping you and therefore it's extroverted. It's still your opinion, right? It's still the subject, right? It's still you doing the feeling or the thinking in this case. Okay, so hopefully this helps. it isn't, just sort of confusing the matter even more. But I always sort of get a little cringy when I see people describe extroverted thinking as objective and introverted thinking as subjective, and how that can lead to all kinds of confusion. Same thing for extroverted feeling, introverted feeling. If you think about it more in terms of the extroverted processes are all about planned behavior, getting from point A to point B in some way. Extroverted thinking has to do with objects in the real world and using a very sort of formalistic, ordinal, linear process. Extroverted feeling is about doing it, getting from point A to point Z, but in the social domain, which may be very nonlinear, right? And you might have to skip around steps because you're dealing with people, and people are unpredictable, unlike objects. And so you have a whole different part of the brain that does that dealing with people, and that's your dorsal medial frontal cortex. and and all the other parts of the brain that it connects to and interacts with. Okay. So, and then on the flip side, think of introverted thinking and introverted feeling as just sort of building up your knowledge base in one domain versus the other. In the introverted thinking, you're building up your knowledge base based off of formal logic. Sometimes you have breakdowns in formal logic, so your knowledge base might be a little off from reality. But in general, if you had a perfectly logical system that had perfect information, true information going into it, then you would, have a introverted thinking matrix or knowledge base that is 100% aligned with reality. So in that respect, it could be objective, right? Because it's true to what is in the outside world. But it's introverted because it's you, the subject, that built it along the way. Okay. And then introverted feeling is, again, sort of building up a knowledge base about the world, but based off of opinions and not so much formal logic, but just value, parts of the brain that assign good versus bad to things. It's very analog. It's not discrete in the way that symbolic logic is. It's very analog and non-discrete. Is something towards the positive end of of the spectrum, or is it towards the negative end of the spectrum? Are red objects out in nature generally towards the positive or generally towards the negative? Are big moving things out in nature generally towards the positive or generally towards the negative? And again, you could have 99.9% of the world share in the same opinion, but it's still subjective in the sense that it's your value, your feeling that is contributing to that internal database, and it's not necessarily working with people in the social domain. Okay, hope that makes sense. Feel free to leave comments, questions, response videos, um, and maybe we'll touch on it sometime in the future again. Okay, thanks. Have a good one.